Today, I'm very excited to welcome Nell Freudenberger, celebrating the release of The Limits. Nell is the author of the novels Lost and Wanted, The Newlyweds, and The Descendant, and of the story collection Lucky Girls, which won the Penn Malamud Award for Excellence in Short Story and the Sue Kaufman Award for First Fiction from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She will be in conversation with Dolen Perkins-Valdez. Dolen Perkins-Valdez is an associate professor in the MFA program at American University here in Washington, D.C. She's also the New York Times bestselling author of Wench, Bomb, and most recently, Take My Hand, which was named a most anticipated book of 2022 by Newsweek. Also, San Francisco Chronicle, Essence, NBC News, and elsewhere. So please join me in welcoming Nell and Dolen.
I don't know if we need mics. What do you think? Can we just speak, or you think we should use the mics? Oh, okay. Got it. My gosh, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for hosting this event, and thank you, Dolen, in spite of your allergies, for being here with me today. So this book started with a story that a scientist told me about diving out over a deep water coral reef off the island of Moorea, which is about half an hour from Tahiti by ferry. She dove to the edge of the reef where it drops off to the deep ocean. And she said she was describing seeing only just this sort of limitless blue. And she said that she felt a sense of vertigo so extreme that her dive buddy had to pull her back as if she had stepped out over a cliff on land. So I never know really I never know what the book is about when I start, but by the end of this book, I realized that it was a book about the natural world in the grip of climate change and the impact that it has on our sort of most personal relationships. So the novel starts with Natalie, who's the scientist on Moorea studying deep water coral. And in the summer of 2020, she sends her 15-year-old daughter, Pia, home to Manhattan to live with her father, Stephen. Stephen's a cardiologist, and it's 2020, so he's treating COVID patients. And he has a new, younger wife named Kate, who's Pia's new stepmother. Kate is a high school teacher in Brooklyn, and she has a student named Athena who is trying to finish her senior year online while also taking care of her toddler nephew. So I'm just going to read I promise it's only 5 minutes. I'm going to read a phone conversation between Natalie and Pia, who has just started attending the Lycée Français of New York, which is a sort of swanky private school on the Upper East Side. And if you have or know any teenagers, you know that it's sometimes hard to talk to them even when you're in the same room, much less 6,000 miles away. Tell me your classes again, she asked one day, struggling to get her daughter to talk. Natalie thought Pia's tan was fading, although it was hard to tell from the phone's camera. Pia was lying on her bed in the apartment Natalie didn't recognize, against pale blue cotton pillows, the kind of innocuous bedding you might select for a teenager you didn't know. I have English literature and history in English, and also the sexual health workshop. French literature, chemistry, economics, and math are in French. Why history in English but economics in French? No idea. What do you learn in the sexual health workshop? Oral sex, reusable menstrual products, pornography. How useful. Truly, Pia said dryly. Zach had to name 4 types. 4 types of pornography? That would have been no problem for him. But it was 4 reusable menstrual products. He only knew 2. I don't think I know of any. Oh, and Mandarin. Mandarin is in Mandarin. Mandarin? I hate it. Why did you choose it? Dad chose it. Why did you allow him to do that? But Pia was no longer interested. Natalie felt a sort of panic. In a moment, Pia would say that she had to go, and Natalie might not reach her again for 3 or 4 days. It was incredible to think that if Stephen's wife wanted to see Pia, she could simply walk into the next room. Behind her daughter's head were the blue pillows, and behind the blue pillows, an empty white wall. Have you decorated your room? No. Have you taken the things from the suitcase? No. I see. Was there a part of her that took pleasure in Pia's failure to adapt? She decided that no, there wasn't. The research station wasn't the right place for Pia, nor was her sister's family, where she would be forced through the ruthless machine of the French school system. And it wasn't so terrible to grow up a little before you decided how you wanted to live your life. That first year they'd spent together in Moorea, she was 5. Stephen was able to join them twice for only a week each time. And so Natalie always felt unkind, saying that it was the happiest period of her life. That year, when she finished her work, or as a break if she had to go back to the lab, she would ride her sim along the coast to the Montessori in Tamai near the airport. She would wait outside the gate with the other parents for the children to finish singing their songs, Ah, les crocodiles and Tourne, Tourne, Petit Moulin, but also some in Tahitian, including one about the crown of thorns starfish, the corallivorous echinoderm whose devastating effects she was studying at the time. In the song, the sea stars ate the coral, and then they went down to the bottom of the sea and the coral revived, everything in its own time in a cycle. She loved the idea, but the evidence was against that kind of recovery continuing indefinitely into the Anthropocene. Blissfully unaware of these facts, the children would emerge, taking their backpacks from a row of wooden hooks. The children were Tahitian, French, American, and British. You heard at least 3 languages as they embraced their parents and caregivers. The fenced play area had swings and a tiny climbing structure shaped like a ship. Not a canoe, but a cruise ship with a fin-shaped stabilizer accessible by a ladder, from the top of which you could see the glittering turquoise water of the public beach. She felt like the perfect mother when she picked Pia up from the Montessori, and she wanted to hear all about it. But like most children, Pia wasn't inclined to give a detailed report of her day. And so she asked the only question that prompted a response, a question she thought she might as well try now. Did anything funny happen today? Pia remembered. Natalie could see it in the half smile, even on the screen. Someone ate a bee. What? Jacob is his name, I think, or maybe Jules. Was Jacob or Jules stung? It was dead. Why would anyone eat a dead bee? That's what the teacher asked. And he thought it would be funny. Boys are quite young at your age. Obviously, Pia said, oh, and I guess this is also funny. Dad's having a baby.
Love that. Nell, I'm so happy you're here in DC. Yay! Are we all so happy she's here?
Oh my God. I can't believe I read without my glasses. It's like a miracle. I forgot to put them on.
Well, you probably know it so well.
Yeah,
Right?
I do.
Yeah. So this is book number 5 or 4?
This is 4th novel, though.
The 4th novel.
Yeah.
Because you had a story collection.
That's right. Yeah.
How does it feel? I feel like so many of our peers, and the ladies were just saying this is my second Politics and Prose
event this
week.
So Dolen has really put it. This is called literary service.
It is, but it's the best kind, right? And so many of us are on number 4 or 5.
But that's I think that might have something to do with our age, right?
Yes, right. And I'm just wondering, where do you see yourself right now as a writer? Do you know who you are as a writer?
I do know who I am as a writer, but I don't find that it gets, I don't know if others of you are writers, but I don't find that it gets easier to start a new book or even to get to the comfortable middle of a book, which is the place I'm most happy being. I much prefer it to the time when you're not sure if it's going to work or the time when you're promoting a book. That middle is what you strive for, where you feel comfortable and you can see the end, but you're not quite sure how you're going to get there yet.
I feel the same. Like when I start something, it's like I've never written a book before.
Yeah.
But I do know how to put a book together, I feel like now. I don't have the sort of fear of the unknown anymore.
Well, I don't know if we've ever talked about this before, but we should talk about research, because I'm curious to know because your books also require a lot of research, and I'm curious to know whether most of it comes before you start writing or if you are doing it all the way through.
Well, since this is your day, we're going to talk about that.
I tried to distract and
Well,
divert.
here's something because I want to start with your research. And the thing that's different about me and Nell, y'all, and we do clearly know each other, right, is that she writes contemporary novels and I write historical novels, but we both do research.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to begin with your research and just ask you about the genesis of this book, the kinds of research you do. And then I do want to end that with us talking about, what's the difference between what research does for a contemporary novel versus what it does for a historical novel?
Yeah.
I'm curious about that. I'm so scared to write a contemporary novel.
I feel the same way about something set in the past. Absolutely. It's like, how do you know what the doorknobs look like? It's like every single thing you need to check.
But how do you know what they look like now? I don't know what they look like now. Just reach for it. Okay, well, let's hear about your research.
Okay. So I knew that I started with this scientist, Natalie, and I knew that she studied deep water coral, which was something that I was interested in. But the main thing I knew about her was that she was intimidating to her ex-husband's new wife, and she's French, so what's more intimidating than a French person? And that I knew she worked on this island, Moorea, because Moorea is a sort of epicenter of coral science, and that's because there are 2 research stations on the island, and it's a really small island. It's about 5 miles across if you've ever been there. A popular honeymoon destination. But one of the labs is owned by Berkeley, and the other one is a French national lab called CRIOB. And so I knew that Natalie worked at CRIOB, and I knew that I had to go see it. And so it is really tricky to get a magazine editor to assign you a piece in Tahiti. They don't believe you when you say you have to go there, even if you have a really good reason. So it took me almost a year to get this assignment from Nautilus Magazine, which is a wonderful science magazine, kind of for general readers and a kind of literary science magazine. And I went with the idea that I just was going to interview scientists and find out what was going on with cutting-edge coral preservation. And like everything that happened to me when I went to Moorea, I completely changed the subject of the article and really a lot about the book when I got there. The approach, if you've been there, from Tahiti is by ferry, and it takes about a half an hour. And what I was expecting were the pictures that you see in travel magazines, which are like the sort of turquoise lagoon and the white sand beaches and those beautiful bungalows that are incidentally terrible for coral reefs that sit out over the lagoon. But what you see when you're approaching is none of that. It's a mountain coming straight out of the water, and there are a million shades of green, and it almost looks like a scrap bag of fabric in all different, greens, kind of like velvet almost, with the clouds on it. Really, really beautiful, and I felt like the mountains were the thing that I kept kind of going back to, not only when I was there, but in the book. I hiked up with this group of Berkeley undergrads who, I've never done a harder hike in my life. I felt like I almost died, or maybe that they were going to lose me. They were all in really good shape.
That would have been me. I would have had a stick and everything.
We all had sticks. There were parts where you had to climb on a rope. It was bananas. I was wearing not even proper shoes. Anyway, but when you get to the top, it's incredibly beautiful. It's a mountain that's famous for having a hole in the peak. And there's a legend about a god shooting an arrow through the top of the mountain and this hole being there. What happened really when I was there was that the subject of the story changed from the Western scientists who were studying coral to the indigenous science that had been there all along. And it was this moment when Western scientists were realizing that a lot of the conservation methods that they were using were coming back around to methods that had been there since before Europeans first made contact in Tahiti. And it was really the predicament of those scientists that I think I related to, which was kind of the place where they can do their work. If you're a coral scientist, you can't live in Philadelphia, right? There are only a few places where you can do your work. they were suddenly realizing, and maybe they were realizing hundreds of years too late, that they didn't really belong there. And what was the upshot of that? And so that is kind of what I wrote the piece for Nautilus about, and I think it is in the novel as well.
And I heard that you went diving. Did you dive?
I did. I learned to dive for this book. I sort of knew that I was going to have to, and I kept like putting it to the back of my mind because it really scared me. And I was like, maybe snorkeling will be enough. It's so different.
You mean diving versus snorkeling?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Are you a diver?
I would never dive.
Yeah. Well, it freaked me out, and I felt like I had to do it for the book. And then when I did it for the first time, I was in Belize. I had done my training, the online part, and then you go in the pool, and then I went to Belize, which is closer than French Polynesia, to do this dive. And the first dive I went on was just like what that scientist had described to me. And I had thought you maybe had to be advanced or something, but of course there are many places where the ocean steeply drops off from a reef, and I had that same experience of feeling, as you swim out, well, I know I can't fall, right? I'm in the water, but you do feel like you're going to fall.
How deep did you go?
Well, you have a 60, for open water diving, your limit is 60 feet, so it's not super deep. But I knew I would think the fish were beautiful, but I found myself really moved, and this is weird, by the sponges. The sponges I saw on this reef were bright yellow or bright purple, some of them like 6 feet tall, shaped like those vases that sit on the floor. And I had been reading a little bit about the deep ocean and learning that there are some sponges. The oldest thing that's ever been identified, the oldest living organism, is a sponge that is supposed to be 11,000 years old. They're part of the same phylum as coral. There are coral that were around, when the pharaohs ruled Egypt. It's just astonishing what's down there and how protected it's been by the cold and the dark and the pressure down there. It's just so inaccessible in the deep ocean. So obviously I didn't go.
A lot of that, right? Climate change is changing a lot
Well, climate change so an interesting thing about coral is how much it's affected, because so much of it is in shallower waters. But there's scientists who are really excited about the possibility of deep water coral, of kind of reseeding reefs at lower depths, so that it's protected from the heat. That is one of the things that bleaches coral. If you've ever seen pictures in magazines of that really white coral where it's like symbiotic organisms have left it. Those little organisms are what give it its color. And so when the ocean heats up, those little organisms freak out and leave the coral, and that's what leaves it looking like a skeleton, basically. But one of the most interesting stories that I heard when I was there, and this was kind of related to the indigenous science, was a few months before I came, there was a big news story about a reef that had been discovered off the coast of Tahiti. It was between 100 and 250 feet below the surface in the mesophotic zone. Between 100 and 250 meters down in the mesophotic zone, which is the lowest depth to which light penetrates. And so the corals down there look like roses because their plates spread out to catch as much light as possible. So they called it a rose garden. They said it was pristine. It was such an exciting discovery. It was everywhere, the BBC, the New York Times, the same photos, beautiful photos, and it was a UNESCO mission that had found it. And of course, the word discovery is the most loaded word that you can use in the Pacific, right? Because it harkens back to these missions of, to James Cook and Louis de Bougainville. And so when I started asking around, because I was lucky enough to meet some spearfishers through the Berkeley students, I was asking around about this reef and this discovery, and the guy who was the head of the kind of competitive spearfishing association in Tahiti said, "Who discovered that reef?" He said, "It was our ancestors, and they've known about it for hundreds of years. And we dived down there without any equipment. There are competitive spearfishers who can stay down under the water for just insane amounts of time, to insane depths." And one of the guys who's older was saying that he told us that his first pair of goggles he made himself out of the bottoms of 2 Coke bottles and some rubber from bicycle tires. And he had been spearfishing his whole life. So it was just that kind of tension between the scientists who'd been there for 50 years and the people whose ancestors had been there forever was interesting to see.
Well, see, now I just realized that's another thing that we get with a writer that's had 5 books, y'all.
Long answers.
Long, informed answers. Like, you're in the hands of somebody who did the work, right?
You were the sweetest.
And that's, and so like I can learn something, but I can be sure that Nell has done her work. You know what I mean? And so I feel like I'm in good hands with you.
Well,
What did you major in
hope that
college? You're so smart.
Likewise.
What did you major in?
I was an English literature major.
You were
What were
English
you?
major?
What were you?
I was African American studies,
Okay.
which fits with what I write. But
Yeah.
you're like a biology.
Well, I often wish that I'd done a science. These days, I wish I had done a science. I probably wouldn't have been able to hack it, but I love science.
That's your passion.
Recently, it's been kind of what I've been excited
Well,
about.
we had this after I read the early copy of the book. Nell and I had this conversation about whether or not I was Natalie or Kate, or whether she was Natalie. Have anybody read the book? So like Natalie is the sexy marine biologist who's like in Tahiti and Kate is the school teacher who's kind of conservative and buttoned up. That's the new wife.
Yeah, we both wanted to be Natalie.
So we
but
were both saying we were
worried that
Natalie.
might be
I was like, I
Kate.
think I'm more Natalie, but clearly you're Natalie and I'm Kate.
I think we're. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think
That's what I'm
anyone's
feeling right
Natalie.
now. I'm feeling
probably.
like Kate. I'm the school teacher.
Well, I worry. So I did an event in Brooklyn at the beginning of the week, and it was great. But at the end, someone said to me, wow, why don't you just write nonfiction? You do all that research, and then on top of that, you have to think of a story to go with it. And I was like, oh dear, I've explained it wrong, right? Because really, when this book started, it was like this is so silly. It was an anecdote that a friend told me about, and she was newly engaged. And she's a really stylish dresser, this young woman. And I saw her one day, and she was wearing a kind of high-necked blouse, like very Little House on the Prairie, and a long skirt, and but not as stylish as the one Nagar is wearing.
Very stylish.
And I was like, you look beautiful, but different. And she's like, oh, well, today's an assembly at the school, and I'm going to see his kids, and there are going to be a lot of people there, ex-wives, ex-wives' friends. And, it's always something like that a character comes from. For me, that was like the beginning of Kate. Natalie was something I read about Coral, but it usually comes from a human story more than extensive research.
Right. Well, it must. Otherwise, it is nonfiction, right? But even nonfiction can have really interesting characters,
Well, and I don't know if you find this, but like for me, it's much more about like doing the research over the course of the project so that I have the confidence to do the writing, and I have to keep learning all the way through. But most of the stuff that I read doesn't go into the book. And I don't find that, like, I do take notes just because I think we're like the same kind of like dutiful, like I like a gold star kind of student. Like that's
we need the teacher's pet.
Yeah, exactly.
Sign.
So I do all the notes, but I don't find I look at them, almost never. The things that are going to go in the book just are the ones that stick in my head.
You go down a lot of rabbit holes
Oh, yes.
for no reason.
Yeah.
Me too.
Tons of rabbit holes.
Yeah. And I guess that goes back to your question about like, do we research during versus before?
Yes, exactly.
I feel like, I'm sort of like you. You have to research during because you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
Until you start writing the story. There's so many different things you could know about, but if it isn't relevant to the story, you're wasting your time.
That's right.
You have to know what you need to know, right? And you don't know what you need to know until you start
right,
writing.
but I don't really think it's a waste because I think it like the research cut for at least for me sort of like alleviates the anxiety that comes from writing.
It does.
And
it also helps you to just begin.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like,
Those
because otherwise
hours,
you have to scrap the draft because then you're like, oh, that didn't work. A marine biologist would never do that.
Right.
Have you ever scrapped pages?
Oh, yes. In fact, in this book, there's a ship at the beginning of the novel that's sitting in a bay called Apanahu Bay that's very beautiful. It's on the north side of Marin. It's a long, narrow bay. And at the beginning of the book, the ship was a cruise ship. And if it had a symbolism, it kind of represented the French presence in Polynesia. And the thing that people were angry about was colonialism, and that is certainly true. I mean, I found that again and again. But for French Polynesia, also, it's very unlikely that if you had a referendum on independence today, that French Polynesia would vote to separate from France, because economically that would be sort of suicidal. And so by the end of the novel, well, after especially, I had some really great helpers, especially a wonderful professor at the University of Manoa in Hawaii. And he said, I just think that this relationship to the ship is not quite right. Like, what else could it be? Have you read anything about deep sea mining? And I happened to have read a bunch about deep sea mining, and I thought, oh my God, that's it, right? So I really did rewrite a lot to change that ship to a mining ship. And it made so much more sense for the story in the end. But I throw away a lot. I mean, I've thrown away whole novels. I don't know if you've been there.
God, I would die if I had to throw away a whole. I mean, I've had novels that didn't get published. I guess you could say those were throwaways.
Yeah.
Painful.
That's
something you said just reminded me, and we can move on from the research. We could talk research all day, but like one of the things you learn as you become a more seasoned writer is that you don't have to do all the research. You can actually just call people. Like you said, you talk to the professor. Like I have recently, in the last couple of books, learned how to do that, how to use people as resources rather than feeling like I have to read every book in the library.
Absolutely. And I think the books are less valuable. I mean, I think I read the books so that I can get the magazine assignment, so I can go and say, I'm here from Nautilus Magazine. Would you agree to an interview? And it's the interviews that are always the most helpful. Okay. And especially because I can't go. When I was younger, I could go and spend like a month, 3 months, a year teaching English somewhere. I don't have that flexibility now. And so, I'm so nervous when I go somewhere for 8 days, somewhere that was really far away and hard to get to, because I think like, oh my God, I'm not going to get it all. And a really smart friend of mine, Julie Oringer, who I think you also know.
Julie.
Yeah. So Julie was like, Nell, you're not getting everything you need on this trip. You're just making the relationships. You're getting email addresses is what you're getting. And that's absolutely right. And it's an important thing to remember, because it's those relationships that are going to give you what you need. Often people tell you the most useful nugget when you're in the middle of a conversation and you've strayed, you start chatting, and then they tell you. There was a young guy I met who runs a tourism business on Moorea, and if you ever go, he does these food tours that are apparently amazing. I didn't have time to do it, but supposedly great. And we met at a beautiful little outdoor pastry shop in Moorea, and he said, look around us. Look at these people. He's like, they're teachers, they're civil servants. They make 3 times what a Tahitian makes, and they don't pay taxes here. And that, he told me a lot of other stuff during our coffee, but that was kind of one of the most useful nuggets that I came away with. So I think that it's
amazing.
It's the asides that people tell you.
Totally.
He was really good friends with a lot of the scientists who worked at CREOB and the Berkeley station. But he said that the thing that like grounded him every day was that he'd take a swim in the lagoon in the morning, like right when he woke up. And he said, I love these people, but sometimes I find their equipment, like fish cages, or something that marine biologists use, they're abandoned equipment in our lagoon, and I just can't believe that they couldn't be bothered to take it out of the water. Again, that was like really, really useful way of kind of thinking about.
And people are so friendly; they just want to share information. I love that too.
People love talking about themselves.
They love talking about the thing they care about.
That's right.
Who else is calling them and saying, "Can you talk to me about this little tiny field?" Okay, let's move on in case people are starting to get tired of us going on about research, because we could do that. Let's talk about the pandemic.
Okay.
And
everybody loves talking about the pandemic.
Well, we're just finally getting an idea of what happened, man. And I'm so grateful to writers like you who are making art of it to help us continue to process. But I want to talk about how you were thinking in this novel about how people's intimacies were altered by the pandemic.
So Natalie and her ex-husband start writing together, kind of writing emails to each other at the beginning of this book, and the emails become kind of progressively more intimate as the book goes on.
Wait, let's make sure they heard what she just said. The husband and the ex-wife are emailing each other, secret emails, really, because the
yeah,
current
they're-
wife doesn't know about them.
Right. So Stephen's a doctor, and he's working at a hospital in Manhattan, and it's overwhelming. And he and his wife is pregnant, and he comes home and he finds that he can't. Some of the most upsetting things that he's dealing with, he feels like he just can't talk to her about them. He thinks maybe if he doesn't talk about them at home, there's kind of one place in his life where it's not happening. So it comes from a good place, but he needs to talk about it with someone, and he's communicating with his ex-wife about their daughter who's just arrived, back into his life. And so their emails become, more intimate than either one of them expects. And I think that part of that is just that I love writing letters. Like, young people today are like, you have letters in your book? Like, what are those? But when I was first living abroad in Bangkok, we didn't have any internet. We didn't have an internet connection, and I wrote a ton of those. I don't know if anyone remembers them, but like light blue aerograms that you would fold up into an envelope. I wrote them to my friends. I wrote them to my boyfriend. Every once in a while, I wrote one to my parents. And I found, I wanted to be a writer. I didn't think it was possible. And I found that those letters, like, suddenly I was writing much better stuff than I wrote when I tried to write a short story. And the reason for that, I think, is because you realize you have an audience, right? When you're a young writer writing something, you just assume no one's going to read what you write, and usually you're right. But when you're writing a letter to someone, you have to like make them laugh. You want them to finish the letter. You want them to turn it over to the other side. And that was some of the best training that I kind of could have had. And so I think I still put letters in books for that reason. It's sort of, there's something that energizes the story.
So there's the intimacy between the husband and the ex-wife. Then there's the stepmother and the stepdaughter, Pia, who are now living together because Natalie has sent her daughter to live with her daddy. All kinds of things like that happened during the pandemic, right? People went to live with people. And so what do you make of the stepmother-stepdaughter relationship and how it's altered by that time?
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting relationship because it's been in literature from, fairy tales to one of my favorite novels is Alice Munro's early novel and stories, The Beggar Maid, about Rose and Flo and their relationship to each other. There's Anne Patchett's The Dutch House. In this novel, I was thinking about when my stepmother first moved in with my dad. I came home. I wasn't living there anymore, but I came home from college, and almost every time I walked into a room that she was in, she would jump, and then she would say, "Oh, I didn't see you there. Hi." The first couple times I was sort of eye-rolling teenager, but then I found myself once leaving the room and starting to cry, and I thought, like, why am I crying? And then I thought, oh, because it's like I broke into my own house, right? And I have a great relationship with her, and she's lovely. But I think I was thinking about, like, why does that relationship work so well in literature? And I think it's because, as a girl, you grow up and you suddenly meet all sorts of women who are potential mothers, they could be role models, they could be threats. Your own mother treats you one way, but every other woman, women have to compete for what they want, right? And you go out as a girl into the world, and it's like everyone is a stepmother. Like, are you my friend, or are you, like, going to stab me in the back, right? And I think that's why the relationship feels charged in a way that was useful for me writing this book.
But in the pandemic, they try to avoid each other, but they can't.
Yeah, there was a lot of people who are like forced into small spaces in this book. Kate has a student named Athena, and she's very much based on the kids that I work with at Penn Writers in the Schools, which is a program that sends writers into New York City schools to help with college essays and what have you. And I was familiar with working with kids who, were also doing other jobs on the side. Sometimes I'd be doing a Zoom with a kid who was like making a smoothie at Jamba Juice, or like a kid who's like, I'm so tired because I was delivering cookies for insomnia last night. But then during the pandemic, there were all these girls who suddenly had been tapped for childcare, which makes sense because if daycare is closed and your parents are an essential worker, of course it's the teenage girl who's going to be asked to stay home with the kid. So over and over again, you're on a Zoom, and there was one girl I said, "Do you mind turning? You don't have to, but would you turn on your camera?" Just because a lot of times I hadn't seen them at all because they'd been remote for the whole year. And she's like, "I would, but my hands are so wet because I'm giving my nephew a bath, and he's an infant, and I was like, oh my God, you're dictating your college essay and you're giving a baby. Babies are super slippery. Like when you're bathing a baby, you need to like focus. And I was like, why don't you do that? And then we'll get back to this. And then there was another girl who I have since become close to, but she had sort of constant care of her 3-year-old nephew. And we worked together a bunch, and she always turned on her camera, which is maybe where our connection started. But her nephew always wore a Spider-Man suit. And there was one day where he had it like half on, like the pants were on, but the suit part was down. And she's looking at me and talking. She's focused. And she reaches down and she does that thing like, a pull-up diaper has like a little tab on the side, and you can take it off without undoing everything. She did that really quick and put on another one kind of without like thinking about it. And I was like, oh my God, I didn't learn to do that until I was in my early 30s. And, I was watching girls take care of young kids with not just routine care, but like with love and creativity, inventing things to keep them amused in a way that I often struggled to do during the pandemic. And I was moved by that, and I just kind of wanted to honor it, I guess, in this book.
And it's interesting how, one thing about you, Nell, you don't shy away from class in your books. You are, you don't pretend like everybody lives in, Park Slope or wherever.
I sometimes get in trouble for it, but...
You do? For paying attention to class?
Sometimes.
I love it about your work. And one of the things that the pandemic was so really brutally clear about was class difference. And I feel like if you had written this book and not at least highlighted some of that.
Well, it was so apparent during the pandemic, right? All of the things that are apparent about class in New York City all the time just became even more sharply delineated.
They did, and I agree with you. Like these teenagers, because my teen too was taking care of the little one, but also they had been doing it all along. I mean, you know what I mean?
Sure.
A lot of those, and younger, I see them here in D.C., they have to go get their little brother or sister from school, and they're like 12,
Yeah.
And in the pandemic, it highlighted sort of like the labor of children and teens in households. And I loved how you framed like this dichotomy between Pia and Athena. Mm-hmm. But they're also like, thinking about the same things, and they both have sort of the same aspirations, but they just have these very different home situations.
Yeah.
I see the little signal over here that we're about to open up for questions.
Okay.
So we're going to ask you to go to the mic because they are recording. Or are you going to bring the mic to them? Okay.
So just raise your hand if you have a question. No pressure.
Thank you. I'm excited to read the book.
Thank you.
So I'm curious about your going as a journalist to places to do your reporting and for the book, for the novel, and wondering if, as a novelist, if you approached these places and said, I'd like to come do research for my novel, especially as a published novelist, like, is that something that you feel like you wouldn't have the access?
Well, I like to cover my expenses, so that's part of trying to write an article. But I think people are more wary when you say that, and it just seems like a weirder enterprise. And so I don't lie about it. Like I always say, I'm working on this article for Nautilus about Western and Indigenous science on the island, and also I'm writing a novel. So I'm that will involve a coral scientist on Moorea. So I'd love to see your lab if you're open to that. I did, but somehow I've done this forever, like since the first, not the first book, because that was like very much based on the time that I spent in India and Thailand, but since the second book, just pitching a story to in order to do the research that was necessary for the book. And it just works because it's kind of like an icebreaker. You start talking about something that's very concrete and familiar, and then certain people will open up and are excited about the idea of fiction as well.
This is more a comment than a question. Excuse me. I adored the Newlyweds.
Oh, that's so nice of you. Thank you so much.
And I loved the way you told a particular yet very relatable, even universalizable story through one person's journey and through coming to know her so well. Is there, I haven't yet read The Limits, I'm looking forward to, is there a specific person who you made a deep connection with, who informed any of the characters in this book in a way that seems similar to what might have happened in the background of the Newlyweds?
That's interesting. Yeah, my relationship with the woman who inspired the Newlyweds is long, and it was kind of 5 years of interviews working on that book, and we're still in touch. I think actually I think the person that I'll stay in touch with forever that I was this young woman who I met before working through Penn Writers in the Schools. And I didn't meet her to do research for a book. I was actually kind of surprised when I started writing this character. And what I normally do is say, I've started writing this. How do you feel about it? Let's talk about it. Do you feel okay about it? I want to use this, this, and this from your experience, and everything else is going to be invented. And it's surprising how many people are okay with that. I haven't really had a person say, no, although I'm sure those people are out there. So in this book, she's graduated several years ago and is in college, and she came to the reading in Brooklyn, which was really nice for me. And she was like, now I can come to the after party because I'm 21. I also I was reading, I just wanted to read as much Tahitian fiction and poetry as possible, and I ended up meeting the translator of Tetuawa Pua, who's a well-known Tahitian novelist, and he's a French translator, and we hit it off, and he's become a good friend. So I think that is another relationship that will stay from this book. That's kind of one of the great pleasures, right, of writing the books, is that you know people that you wouldn't have met otherwise. Allison.
No. You write from so many different voices, men, women, young, old. Do you find some easier to take on than others? And are they the ones that are closer to you, or the ones that are further away from who you are?
That's a good question. They are the ones that are too hard. I don't sometimes I start on something and it doesn't work, and it's just clear that it doesn't work. If there's a voice that's working, then I stick with it because I don't have that many voices that work. But it is much easier for me to write from a point of view that's farther from me, whether it's because the person's a man or because they've grown up in a totally different world than I did. I find characters who are really similar to myself absolutely the hardest. And in fact, Pia, whose relationship with her stepmother is sort of based on mine, I thought at first I wouldn't tell the story from her point of view. I wasn't very interested in her. It just didn't seem like it made sense for the book. And then I hit on the idea of a journal for her, and she writes in a very, she's kind of a fledgling actress. She likes to write about conversations she's had with people in dialogue as if it's in a play. She writes sometimes in text messages. And sometimes she just catalogs things that she's doing research about on Wikipedia. And that's true of the nuclear tests in this book. And she learns about the nuclear testing in French Polynesia from being there, but also from just the internet. And she kind of can't believe the extent of what she hasn't learned in school. And that was very much true for me, kind of learning about testing in the Marshall Islands when I was researching this book. So she kind of worked for me as in a written form in a way that she didn't when I, if I was just trying to tell the story from her point of view.
For both of you, I find your sort of immense curiosity for your source material so inspiring. How much of the process of writing about the pandemic and climate change, such anxiety-provoking large issues, is a coping mechanism?
Well, I know Nagar's an incredible painter, so I know that this question must come up in her own work as well. I don't know. It's I don't love the idea of art as therapy exactly, but certainly the things that I had the one writing teacher who someone said in our MFA program, how do you know what your themes are? And he was like, your themes are your obsessions, right? And of course that's right. You already have your unfortunately your themes have been planted in you long ago, by whatever events happened in your early life, and they keep coming out. So I think in that sense, the things that you're anxious about, I come out in my work, and I assume the work of all writers, maybe painters too.
I'm curious a little bit about your process and how much, talk a lot about introverts and extroverts and what type of things energize you or exhaust you. Like in writing a novel, is there a moment where you just feel you've poured your entire self out and you just need a rest afterwards? Or where do you find like your energy just peaks? And secondarily, how long does it take you to start working on something again? And if you are working on something, I'd love to hear what that is.
Thanks. Working on something new. I'm working on stories, which I love. My first book was stories, and I always write them in between novels, and it's a way to do something where you can see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's not quite as scary as starting a novel, because if it doesn't work, it's a couple weeks of work as opposed to, sometimes they take a really long time when they're successful, but when you're throwing it away, it's usually only been a week or two. So that's comforting, and it also lets you explore a lot of different things. You write something in the third person, you do something in the third person. Like, I don't know if people know Tessa Hadley's work, but her most recent book is After the Funeral, and I just love those stories. And she does something where she just switches points of view at kind of unevenly through the story, right? Sometimes like the last paragraph will be in the voice of a character you didn't expect to speak. And I love that, and I love to try things like that, in a less high-loaded kind of form, I guess. I don't think they're not easier than novels for sure, but they just take less time. And I don't know, in terms of exhausted, I'm just so happy when it's working. That's when I feel the best. Like a day where I have been really focused and working for 3 or 4 hours is a great day, no matter what happens after that. The worst times are just when you read it and it's like dead on the page, and right away when that is, and it's just so demoralizing. So that's just keep hoping for that sort of charged feeling.
At one point, you said you didn't think you'd ever be an author, if I heard you correctly, and that's shocking to me because you're amazing. So when did you know, how did you know, and who helped you get there?
It was just when the first story was published. I just didn't, I knew I would write, but I just didn't think that it was going to get published. You just can't believe it's going to happen, sort of. And I still feel like every time, I'm like, please let it sell enough copies to give me another contract, right? So...
Where was your first story published now? Don't say The New Yorker. Don't say it. It was The New Yorker. Oh, my God.
This was my big moment, Dolen. It's all been downhill from that first New Yorker publication.
That is hilarious.
Yeah, we were... I have had one other story in my decades of writing published there, so it's not like it then just was easy. It was harder after that. Yeah. I wish I could have some of the excitement that people had about being a 25 or 26-year-old, however old, publishing a story in the New Yorker. There were magazines articles about it. It was like a big hullabaloo, and I was like, ooh, must be what it's like. And it is not like that. This is a big crowd, right? You're often in a Barnes and Noble in Iowa City, and there's one person there, and you're like, hi, you're here. And they're like, oh, I was actually just looking for the new, Amor Towles novel or whatever. So yeah, it is humbling, yeah. And and also it's what else would we do, right? If this is what you do, it's what you do.
So the stories have the new book, or is it in, or where are we on that?
No, I'm just writing some stories. I don't know that I can sell. Selling a book of stories is a real uphill battle. So I don't know that.
That's just what you're.
That's what I'm doing right now. Yeah. Fingers crossed someday another story collection. Yeah.
I would love another story collection from you.
From your mouth to God's ear.
Yeah. All right. Any other? How are we doing on time? We done?
We're good on time if anyone has any other questions.
That was a lot of questions from a small crowd. Thank you, guys. That was really nice.
Prepared.
I want to know your favorite character you've ever written. If you could manifest them in real life.
Oh, well, that's kind of a different question, right? You sometimes like the less appealing characters more. That's a great question, and I'm not sure I know. There was a teenager actually in the first book who was writing a letter to her father who she didn't really know, but she knew that he was a professor at this university, and she was applying to college, and she wrote a letter to him. He was a well-known writer, and she wasn't in touch with him, and her mom wasn't in touch with him, and she wrote this letter to him about why she didn't want to go to his college and why she wasn't interested in his work. And that girl, I don't really know where she came from. It's not my story, but she was funny, and it was kind of all. I think, honestly, I think it was all my feelings about what happened when I published that first story, and which was wonderful and exciting and allowed me to have the kind of job of my dreams, and also was really like the kind of deer in the headlights. It was different the way women were treated in the media in the 2000 than it is now, and I was pretty young, and some of the things that they, the photos and stuff they wanted to do were not what I wanted to do, but I didn't feel like I could say no at that point. I was just like so grateful for the book contract. And so I think that girl's voice was like the response to that, was like the smart young woman who I wanted to be saying no, basically. So maybe she's the one.
Maybe we could end by just asking you what you're reading now. Oh, did I see another hand? Oh, another one? Oh, okay.
Hi, this is kind of a kitchen sink of a question, so if it's too much, But so you're talking about these little sparks that sort of form, the what's going to be the impetus for a novel. And so you've got the girl or the woman who is going with the high neck thing on, and and then you've got the themes of your childhood and your stepmother, and then you've got climate change and the pandemic. So when you're sitting with all these things, like, how do you know what to do with them, like in terms of like folding them into a plot together? Like, how do you actually get from those little pieces to the arc of the story that you're going to write?
It's a great question. I think it's, I knew when I started this book that it was going to be, told in these different voices. I thought it was four, and then Athena kind of jumped in and told her story. So it's really, I don't know why it works this way, but you write one person's section, and then the next section occurs to you, or that narrator's next section that's going to come like 5 chapters later occurs to you, and you maybe make like a rough outline, down at the bottom of the page, but I don't start with an outline. My dad was a screenwriter, a TV writer, and there was a very kind of strict form that he used, and he had a cork board, back in the day, and little Post-its that were pinned up there, and he would move them around, and that looks like a great way to put together like a narrative piece of work, right? I wish that it was like that because it would be so comforting, but it doesn't work that way at all. It's like I don't love the thing of the idea that a character tells you what to do, right? That it's sort of like a bolt of inspiration from the blue, because that to me that sort of diminishes the idea of like practice, of like that it's working hard every day that makes it work. One day it's like you sit there and you slog and you slog and you slog, and then one day the voice sounds right and you just go. But it's those days where it seems to be going forward that make the plot happen. And the bigger pieces of research, I guess they just, they come in when you need them. Like you've been reading about something, like it's the deep ocean, and then there's a paragraph about all the things that Natalie, all the creatures that Natalie can't believe, we might lose if these companies start doing this mining of the deep ocean, right? And so I know about those because I read a book a while ago, and I might go back to it, but it's really her, it's really the moment where she goes outside to get drunk because her daughter's just told her that her ex-husband's having a baby, and she starts thinking about this, this stuff. I don't know if that answers the question. Not really. Sorry.
Maybe there's no real answer, and maybe it's different for each book. But it just seems really daunting to me to go from those ideas that are good, or those anecdotes, or those themes, and then knowing, okay, I'm going to have a book, where this is how I weave the themes in, and this is what the plot will be. I guess that's...
Well, there's a moment where I was doing a Zoom interview with that guy who has the food business, and he mentioned... Now, I just am wondering what it was, because it wasn't a bomb and a deep sea mining ship. But during that conversation, I suddenly thought, oh, I know what he mentioned. He mentioned the Rainbow Warrior, which was a Greenpeace ship that had a limpet mine attached to it by French people who turned out to be like in the employ of the French government. And that was to keep the ship from doing this protest that it was going to do in the Marshall Islands, to call attention to the nuclear testing and the effects of the nuclear testing that were happening there. And so when he talked about that, I knew about that incident, and I thought, oh my God, now I understand this, like what's going to happen with this ship at the end of the novel. And that kind of plot point, that it's coming to a climax in a harbor at night where this ship is sitting, is really helpful, because it's like a light, that you're moving toward, kind of keeping you on track, I guess, a lighthouse.
Okay. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you both so much for coming as well. If you're interested in purchasing the book, again, we have copies available at the register. If you could do us a favor and fold up your chairs and place them against something sturdy to help the staff, that would be great. The signing line will start right here, and thanks so much for coming.